You want the dungeon? You get the dungeon. Hey, it's Dave Salvadore of Blueline Design. Thanks for coming back to my channel, and a special thanks for all those who subscribed this week after watching my HeroQuest video. It's been very encouraging in building my channel. I had a poll last week. Overwhelmingly, you guys want to see some of the techniques that I use to build my HeroQuest dungeon. There's no way that I'm going to build this thing again. It took about a month to create this, but what I am going to do is share some of the techniques that you can use in your own HeroQuest 3D board build. So let's get right into that today. The first thing to do is to figure out how big I was going to make the board. The original HeroQuest tiles were 7/8 of an inch thick, and they allowed 1/8 of an inch for the thickness of the walls, making it a perfect 1-inch grid. Here are 3 different size options: 1 inch, 1 1/4 inch, 1 1/2 inch, and I'm going to explain to you why I went with a 1 1/2 inch grid system. The goal of this project is to create a 3-dimensional HeroQuest board. If you use the 1-inch system, it doesn't take into account the thickness of the walls. So the moment that I use a 1/2 inch thick piece of XPS foam to make the walls, the miniatures no longer fit. With a 1 1/4 inch grid system, the problem was still the same. Also, I was not able to find 1/4 inch thick XPS foam. I don't have a fancy foam cutter, so that was out of the question. The simplest, easiest solve was to use a 1 1/2 inch grid system. That way I could create the walls without having to try to find 1/4 inch foam or cut foam down, and the miniatures would still fit on tiles that had walls overlapping. Because this project is such a big build, I decided to break it up into segments and work on those segments so that I could feel a sense of progress. The segments would then be attached to a piece of foam board in 2 separate pieces that would come together for ease of storage. For this video, I'm going to remake 1 corner of the board. This way you'll learn from start to finish all the techniques I used to make the whole board. To build the board, I am using a material called XPS foam. It's a pink insulation foam you can get at your local Home Depot. It was about 15 bucks for a gigantic 8-foot by 4-foot piece. I just took my project knife in with me, cut it down to smaller pieces, and I had all the material I needed to build this board. Since HeroQuest is a perfect grid, all you need to do to figure out your measurements is count the squares and multiply times the size of your tile. And since I'm just working on this 1 corner for the build, I just count the squares and multiply times 1.5 inches. First thing is to peel off the thin plastic that coats the XPS foam. I begin by measuring and cutting out some pieces for the hallways and the room. For this project, I'm using a heavy-duty X-Acto blade, and it's best with XPS foam to do several cuts rather than try to cut through it all at once. I then measure out 1.5 inches for each tile, and then using the ballpoint pen, I press down really hard in between each line to create the tile separation. Fine point Sharpie is excellent for drawing in your tile lines, as the ink in the Sharpie kind of melts the foam. And then I like to finish the sides of the tiles as well. Next, I cut out the room piece. The walls were designed to overlap the room tiles in order to keep the hallways as open as possible. Using a ballpoint pen, I lightly score in a 1/4 inch guide to let me know where the walls are going to go. Next, I move on to weathering down the tile pieces by using the X-Acto blade to carve out chunks, and then I'll also use a piece of balled up tin foil to press in some texture. And you can use a wooden dowel or a rolling pin wrapped in tin foil in order to create your own textured roller. You can use a smaller X-Acto blade to carve out some chunks of the foam, also using a pen and the fine point Sharpie to draw in some cracks. And if you need to, you can use some type of sculpting tool to press down your tile lines to make them more pronounced. With the tile pieces completed, I then move on to a base coat of about a 50-50 mix of Mod Podge and craft paint. Putting your tiles on a piece of parchment paper will keep them from sticking to the table, and then I apply 2 thin layers of the Mod Podge craft paint mix. If you feel like the mix is too transparent, you can always add more craft paint. And I ended up doing 2 different colors, a dark gray for the halls and a light gray for the rooms. I mounted the tiles to a piece of black foam board that was about 1/4 of an inch wider so that it would protect the edges from just getting banged around. The tile segments were then glued down to the foam board using 77 spray. And when I did the full board, I used a lot of books and weights to really make sure everything was pressed down. Next, I'm going to share with you how I created the magnet system in the board. Using a piece of thin styrene, I created a small template using a hole punch that I would use as a guide for marking where the holes would go. I used an awl to mark small holes into the tiles. This method will ensure that when I make the walls later that they will line up with the magnets in the floor. Then I used 1/2-inch sheet metal screws to attach the magnets to the floor. The idea is that once the screw is in the tile, you can attach a magnet directly to it. The key here is to not sink the screw too far down into the foam. You want the magnet flush with the surface so that it will have its full strength to hold the wall pieces. Once all the screws are in place, you can just snap the magnets on top, and if you need to make adjustments along the way, it's easy to do. In order to keep the magnets in place from being pulled out all the time, I took some thin styrene, primed it with gray primer, and cut out strips to be glued down over top. 77 spray was the way to go with this, as it sticks very well to the XPS foam. You now have a nice board with magnets embedded into them. In order to make sure that the styrene doesn't peel up, I sealed it down with a couple of coats of the Mod Podge paint mix. Now I can move on to creating the walls. I got some really cool texture patterns off of Etsy for bricks and cobblestone. I made my own rollers using a wooden dowel with some zip ties and hairbands. This was going to be a huge time saver in creating my dungeon walls. I wanted to make walls that felt like beefy dungeon walls, but at the same time didn't bury the characters. So I started with a piece that was 1 3/4 inch high. Then taking my project knife, I carefully skinned off the surface of the foam. This would make the walls feel more handmade and then also allow for the texture roller to really press in the texture to the wall. Then using my foil roller and foil ball, I add a rough texture to the wall. Then pressing very hard, I roll out the cobblestone texture onto the wall. Ah, look at that cobblestone. Then using Woodland Scenic's foam wire cutter, I cut an erratic random pattern on the top. Using my X-Acto blade, I carved up the top to give it a rough feel to it. I was not a fan of dungeons that I saw where the top was clean. I wanted it to have a real grungy feel to it and broken, and almost as if it fades off into the rest of the imagination. Most of the wall pieces I made were T-pieces, corner pieces, single pieces that were just the width of 1 tile, made lots of those. Double pieces that were the width of 2 tiles. I even made some pieces that were 3 tiles wide, but honestly, they did not work well in gameplay. Creating the wall pieces is pretty simple. You just mark out 1.5 inches for each tile or whatever your tile width is and cut them out. I would suggest trimming off just a little bit more on each piece so that the pieces come together easily and they don't rub together. Then I added the texture to the ends of each piece. To make the T sections and the corners, I just mark off a small piece and hot glue them together. Using the little template, I marked the holes where the screws will go in later. Now's a good time to add a couple details to the walls. I'll show you how to make one of these cool catacombs. I had some old skeleton kits that one of my kids glued together. I then primed him and then dug out the tomb that he would live in forever. Once you have the catacomb dug out, a good trick is to carve out a section of the top, then you can glue the body in and then glue the section back. And then I just used hot glue to merge his body into the catacomb and make him one with the wall. Now I'm going to show you how I made one of these old sewer grates. You can also use the same technique if you want to create windows in your dungeon walls. Carefully cut out the sewer hole, finish the other side with a Sharpie, and push in the toothpicks for the bars. Then I simply drill the screws into the wall pieces. This is not only cheaper, but then you're not trying to connect magnets to magnets, which can be a nightmare. Now the pieces are ready to be primed with the Mod Podge Craft Paint base coat. So here's the board with all the magnetized pieces. In case you're wondering, the magnets are really strong. And this piece is now ready to paint. So hope you enjoyed watching that video. Let me know in the comment section below if you plan to create your own 3D HeroQuest board. The next video, I'm going to share the painting and detailing techniques that I used on the board. And until then, keep drawing, keep designing. Welcome to the dungeon! We got fun and games! Wow, that's so bad.